Hello, hello. So here I am back again. This time to have a look at the book Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula by Christian Klaver. And it is not a book I'm familiar with. I ran across it mainly while searching for Sherlock Holmes related content on the internet, and this book popped up, and it certainly sounds interesting. So I read a couple of books, sort of not of the original Sherlock Holmes books written by written by what was it? Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle, of course. So I read a couple of books of more recent variety, not the originals by Arthur Conan Doyle, but the modern sort of interpretations that have been written after Sherlock Holmes arrived in the public domain. And some of these books have placed Cthulhu in, for example, the Lovecraft universe, and from the books by Lovecraft. And it was certainly interesting to see how that sort of combination of content was interpreted. And this is something similar. Here you have not Cthulhu, but Count Dracula. And Dracula should be a formidable opponent. So he is obviously been well, he hasn't been alive for a long time, but he has been at least mentally active, if you could say, for many years, and he should be fairly intelligent and experienced, and he has powers that are not possessed by normal men. So he should be a really formidable opponent for Sherlock Holmes if they had the chance to meet, and that's, well, obviously what is going to happen in this book. I haven't looked into what's the sort of premise and story of this book, apart from sort of what one can deduce from the title. But from the little research I have done is that this book is apparently set in 1902, and the Dracula book was it wasn't specified in the book when it was set, but it's thought to be end of the 1800s when it was written. So it's rather a good match, I think. Both Dracula and Sherlock Holmes exist at the sort of same time period, or rather, you could say that Sherlock Holmes is alive at a time when Dracula arrives in England. So I don't remember all the details of the book Dracula. I read it quite a few years ago, probably when we had the Kenneth Branagh movie, and around that time. and I don't really remember the details, but the sort of overall story is sufficiently part of popular culture for it to at least be able to remember elements of the story. So I won't be spoiling the Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula book, and I can't really spoil much of Dracula since I don't remember any of the details, but it sort of seems like it should be a very good match, having these two together in the same story. And from what little I remember about Dracula, it's that the book starts with him arriving in England. I think it was sort of somewhere sort of outside the big cities, sort of small town, small village. And well, him being Dracula, you can sort of think what kind of events would occur after that. I don't recall the details, but I think there were some strange and unusual deaths and so on that occurred. And that's the sort of thing that would make Sherlock Holmes potentially curious, because you often have him looking at newspapers and news to see sort of what is going on and if there are any criminals at large. And Dracula would be a criminal now, wouldn't he? He sort of abducts people, and he sometimes kills people for their blood, so he would fit the profile of a criminal now, wouldn't he? At least when seen from the viewpoint of civilized society and from the viewpoint of Sherlock Holmes. So it will be interesting to see how this book, the story in this book, plays out. Not only should Dracula be sort of a force to be reckoned with, you also have the sort of overhanging danger of Sherlock Holmes or Watson being bitten and becoming undead. So, since this is recorded while I still haven't read the book, I thought I would sort of amuse myself with speculating about what type of story it will contain. So, how has the author taken the Sherlock Holmes material, the books with Sherlock Holmes, stories with Sherlock Holmes, and Dracula, and sort of adapted these to different set of stories into a single story. And there are some alternatives that are fairly obvious that we can consider. And one of these is that this story in this book, Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula, plays out before the events in the original Dracula book. And while that's a possibility, it sort of seems unlikely. I would think that would require Sherlock Holmes to travel to Transylvania or whatever it was that Dracula is living before the story, and that sort of seems like a stretch. So Another alternative that seems more likely is that this book has events that plays out sort of at the time of the book, meaning that Dracula is adapted to the sort of setting where Sherlock Holmes exists, or rather, if the author of this book, Christian Klaver, has chosen to follow the story in the Dracula book quite closely, at least initially, you could have a premise where you assume that Sherlock Holmes exists and is living in London, and you ask yourself the question, what would happen if Dracula arrived in England while Sherlock Holmes was active and alive? And that's perhaps the sort of most straightforward way to adapt the material, because then you have the framework of the original Dracula book, and you have the character of Sherlock Holmes, and you simply take the story of Dracula and ask yourself, how would the story in Dracula potentially play out differently if Dracula being in England is something Sherlock Holmes became aware of? Of course, he wouldn't sort of presume, at least not know that, oh, Dracula is here, because I would assume that Dracula is really not a known entity outside Transylvania, so he would more... You could imagine that what would happen would be that Dracula arrives in England. There are some deaths that are sort of strange, and Sherlock Holmes picks up on this and starts investigating. And this results in, eventually, a confrontation between Dracula and Sherlock Holmes, with potentially characters like Van Helsing showing up at some point. And that seems like it could be a good possibility for how this book is handled. Perhaps not the most creative approach, but it will certainly be the one that is perhaps easiest and least surprising, you could say. I would think both fans of Dracula and Sherlock Holmes would be able to sort of relate to that sort of approach. And then you have a sort of third alternative, which is the events in this book playing out after the events in Dracula, the book, original book. I must admit I don't recall if Dracula dies or not in the original book, but I guess that doesn't really matter, because even if he dies, well, he's undead, so you can always say that, well, he was sort of dead, but he wasn't really dead, undead, so it's not a problem to sort of bring him back using some kind of excuse, and then you have Dracula and Sherlock Holmes facing off against each other after the events in Dracula. So that's also inserted. Then you will have the events and characters in Dracula to play on, and you have all the characters in the Sherlock Holmes stories that you could also introduce. So that's also one way to do it. Of course, then you have a sort of larger problem of how to what kind of story to tell, because you wouldn't have the framework of the original book, but still it's always possible to create some sort of story where you have Dracula running around in London, for example, and that's a possibility. And then there's the fourth option, which I guess is also possible, which is that instead of being events that are very much tied to the events in the original Dracula book, you could just use the character Count Dracula and the character Sherlock Holmes, and then more or less sort of ignore the events of the book and just create a story which plays out in whatever way you want. So that's also an alternative. You would be much freer to handle everything. You could just say that well, parts of the book was sort of not untrue. You just borrow the elements that you like, and you construct a narrative based on that. You could say that Dracula was written by an author that only had partial information about the events that played out, and the rest he invented. And the true story about Dracula, Count Dracula, is what sort of comes out in this book. That's also a way to handle it. And the sort of straightforward approach to do this would be to, again, to have some unexplained or strange deaths where you have bodies turning up with all their blood missing, which is not usual, and you have Sherlock Holmes and Watson starting to investigate this, eventually leading to a confrontation with Dracula. And you can still introduce Van Helsing and other characters from the book, and use them in whatever way you wanted. And then there's, of course, an additional option, which sort of is more unusual and sort of turns the expected approaches on its head, which is to have, well, what sort of the title to a certain extent would seem to apply, and that's Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula sort of teaming up and going on adventures together. And that's perhaps not the most, what should you say, serious approach. It seems unlikely that Sherlock Holmes would want to team up with someone like Count Dracula, but you could always construct some kind of premise for this, such as there being a common foe they wanted to sort of cooperate on taking down, and that's how the events play out. And that could be interesting. Certainly not be what I would expect from this book or a story about Dracula and Sherlock Holmes. So that could be interesting. And sort of additional variant of this is what if Sherlock Holmes becomes undead? That's perhaps not very likely, but it's undeniable that the powers that Dracula has would sort of be useful for someone like Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he can easily get into sort of not easily accessible places by sort of turning into a cloud of bats, and he does have some sort of mesmerization powers, I think. It's sort of mind control powers, and of course he can't walk around in daylight, which is a drawback, but still, there's several skills he has which might become useful as a crime fighter. So you could have Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula, fighters of crime, which would be an interesting premise perhaps for a book. I don't think this is that book, but it certainly would be an unusual deviation from most of the stories about Sherlock Holmes. Of course, these powers could also be useful if Sherlock Holmes and Dracula cooperated in some way. So you have Sherlock Holmes doing the sort of normal investigation that he does, and then you have Dracula sort of being a backup and using his skill set to do additional tasks. I mean, he can very easily tail people. I mean, he can fly around above people without being detected, presumably, and he can yes, get into places which are not accessible, as I noted, and yes, I think he certainly has a skill set that would come in useful. But I don't really think that's the way this is going. If I am to guess, I would say that this probably is sort of loosely based on events in the original Dracula book, and then you have the somewhat familiar structure of many Sherlock Holmes tales, where there are events that sort of seem to be very strange and supernatural in nature, and that Sherlock Holmes approaches very skeptically and with a sort of scientific skepticism, while Watson is more easily sort of convinced that this might be something supernatural. And since this is Count Dracula he is faced off against, there is, of course, a supernatural, an actual supernatural element to his powers. So you would arrive at a point where Sherlock Holmes presumably would need to sort of accept that we now have events that do not fit into the normal worldview that is sort of generally accepted, the scientific objective worldview. So that's probably the general way that events will play out, if I'm to guess. And of course there's a question of how vampires and vampirism is to what extent it's known in the world at the time when these events play out. You could say that the knowledge of vampires and similar sort of supernatural beings are the level of fairy tales or legends, so they are not thought to be real, but sort of the concept of a vampire and an undead is something that is known, at least conceptually. So it's not like the idea of vampires is new. It's just that it's thought of as something that's not real, similar to unicorns or dragons and so on. It's it's a familiar element from folklore, but not something that's expected to actually exist. And in that case, you would have both Watson and Sherlock presumably being somewhat familiar with the idea of vampires at the beginning of the book, but it would be more natural to think that if you had events that sort of seemed like they were caused by a vampire, then you're more likely to think that there was a more sort of natural explanation for what was happening, such as, worst case, somebody pretending to be a vampire and draining the blood of his victims for some kind of ritual or similar effect. So that's one way it could be handled. But we will have to see if Dracula is a foe of Sherlock Holmes, which I think he'll be. You will eventually also have the question of how to get rid of him, and in that case, the presence of Van Helsing would be sort of useful. So if I'm to guess, he is a character that's so convenient and familiar that it would be somewhat surprising if he didn't show up sometime in the book and help Sherlock and Watson take down Dracula. At least that's my sort of general guess based on just seeing the title and the sort of concept of the book. But how correct am I in these sort of speculations? Well, there is only one way to find out, and that's to read the book. And that's what I will do next. And when I am finished, I will continue recording my thoughts on the book. So for now, I end this, and I will be back soon. So I'm back again, and well, I have not finished the book yet. I have read perhaps the first 1/3 or 1/4 of the book, and I do plan on reading the rest of it, but I had some thought. I just thought I'd record while I sort of still had them fresh in mind. So I'm sort of adding these additional comments while I'm still actively reading the book. So yes, very much enjoying it so far, and the book, I'm not going to spoil it, but just make some comments. The story moves quite quickly from the beginning, so I have a fairly good idea of the sort of premise for the story in the book, and one sort of practical detail it's useful to be aware of before reading this book is that I think it would be helpful for the enjoyment of this book if one is familiar with the story of Dracula beforehand. So reading or watching Dracula before reading this book will probably increase the enjoyment of reading this book. So that's because there are naturally references to and appearances by events and characters from the original Dracula book. So it's not like it's not possible to understand what is going on without being familiar with that story, but I think perhaps the sort of impact of the events in this book will be more interesting if one is familiar with the original story. So as I noted in my first round of comments, I have read the book and seen the movie. So I'm more or less familiar with the sort of broad strokes of the story, if not all the details. So it's not a problem for me, but I think if I hadn't known anything about it, it would probably be at times less enjoyable than it could be. And of course, if I hadn't been familiar with Dracula at all, I might not have been interested in reading a book about Dracula and Sherlock Holmes. But still, sort of going through Dracula in some way before reading this book, that's I would consider that sort of strong recommendation. And from what I recall, the book is fairly enjoyable, and if one does not wish to read through the book, well, there are several movie adaptations that will probably at least makes it possible to be sufficiently familiar with the characters and events of the book that it's not a problem for reading this one. And as to the sort of small general aspects of the story and what direction it goes, well, I made some attempts at guessing how the story would play out, and well, I wasn't entirely correct, really. I anticipated it would go in a different direction than it actually does, and there is also one sort of, let's say that in hindsight, it's a fairly obvious part of the story that I didn't think of at all. So, sort of with regards to how the relationship is between Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula. So, in hindsight, perhaps somewhat obvious, but not something I thought of. And one other detail I noted was that this book, well, as is probably common in many stories about vampires, it sort of defines, let's say, the laws or the rules of vampires and vampirism, and how sort of the powers and the strengths and weaknesses of vampires as they exist in this world work. So again, I'm not going to go into the details there, but it is somewhat detailed, if not fully sort of it's not like game source book or something where the sort of rules are clearly laid out, but it's fairly well defined, even if it's not sort of at an absolute level. So there's a certain level of uncertainty here, but it still goes into some details as to how a vampire interacts with the world. So that's well, that's perhaps to be expected. So, and of course, when you have Sherlock Holmes, he would naturally, upon encountering a creature like a vampire, be fairly rigorous and systematic in how he applies his method to sort of figuring out how these creatures work, to put it like that. So that's also one element that you have in this story. And well, I think that's my main idea so far. It has been enjoyable. I read through the parts I read fairly quickly, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book. So, unless I should want to add any additional comments before I reach the end, the next time I continue, it will probably be upon actually completing the book. So, until then, I will end these comments here. So, goodbye for now. And I'm back again, and I'm still not finished with the book. I thought I'd add some more comments related to how far I gotten, while I still remember. So, very much enjoying it still. I had lots of fun with this one so far. I think I read about 3/4 of the book, and I have sort of noticed some things that I wasn't aware of at the beginning, and one thing is fairly obvious when you're reading it, and that's that this is not a single narrative with Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula. Instead, it's divided into several parts. I think 3 or 4 parts, and I'm now at sort of early part of part 3, and the first part is what sort of the title of the book indicates. It's about Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula, and it sort of introduces this the setting that is in the book by sort of having the world of Sherlock Holmes, and then adding characters and events from the Dracula book to that world, and this has consequences for both the characters in Dracula and the characters in the Sherlock Holmes universe, to use that expression. The second part of the book is sort of a continuation of the first part, but it does not really continue the narrative that relates to Dracula. Instead, it introduces a different setting to the world of Sherlock Holmes. I was somewhat pleasantly surprised by this when I saw the title of the second part, and yes, I thought that one was also very entertaining. So that was a fun addition. The third part, I'm not quite sure what to make of this one yet. It evidently has characters and references from several of the Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories, and I'm not quite sure where it's leading quite yet. It seems like it's partly a continuation of the first part, so we'll see if it now sort of concludes the storyline that was started in the first part, or whether it's a separate story and then there's a sort of overall overarching ending in the fourth and final part. So I'm not quite sure how that plays out yet. But yes, very much enjoyable so far. And as far as I know, I think this is this book is the first in our trilogy. I haven't really checked if the two other books sort of continue the stories that are started in this book. I will have to check that. I think the other books are sort of using characters from other sort of contemporary works of fiction. So I think the second one was related to Jekyll and Hyde, and the third one was some other character, and I'm not familiar with the third one, and I'm not really that interested in Jekyll and Hyde, so I hadn't originally planned to read those books, but if it turns out that those two books also have sort of the same format as this one, of having multiple parts with somewhat shorter stories that all play out in the same setting and continue the story of Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and hopefully also the other characters and elements that are introduced, well, I might reconsider and read those two books also. We will have to see. So I must admit that the setting that this also has created is quite interesting. It would not sort of be a drop-in, easily dropped into the standard Sherlock Holmes storyline, perhaps, but as a standalone thing, I think it works quite well. So I found it entertaining so far. So I did consider sort of plowing through the rest of the book into the early morning, but I decided against it, and I will probably instead try to finish off the last part of the book the next time I sit down to read it. So it was interesting and what's the term? Sufficiently difficult to put down that it was easy to continue reading, and that is what I will do. And this time I think this will probably be the last sort of set of extra comments. So when I return, it will most likely be after having finished the book, and I think that's likely this time. Yes, so I'll be back soon. Goodbye for now. And I'm back again. And this time I have actually finished the book, and I will conclude my look at this book with some final comment. I have already commented quite a lot already, but I'll do a sort of quick impressions, detective review, and then add some final comments and thoughts. So, what did I think of it? I think it was marvelous. It was very entertaining. Perhaps surprisingly so. You never know when you have these modern Sherlock Holmes titles, and especially one that uses not only Sherlock Holmes but also other characters from sort of the time that Sherlock Holmes was around. So combination of Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula, it could easily have gone very badly, but this was not only entertaining but very much entertaining. So this was very, very nice. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and I think it had some brilliant moments. Very nice. I think both fans of Count Dracula and Sherlock Holmes can find entertainment in this one. So I would recommend this one. But onto the detective review. So here I look at a couple of points. Is it a story starring action hero Sherlock Holmes or not? And does it reward paying attention to the story, such as in is there a villain or something that can be deduced by sort of following along the story, and then by one's own mental powers deduce who is the criminal mastermind or evil genius or whatever, or simply the murderer. And third point is there some detecting going on? And finally, one point which I have added recently, are there some references or appearances or similar to Moriarty? Which is, it seems quite common in these modern adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. So to start at the top, yes, this is to a certain extent an action story starring action hero Sherlock Holmes. And that's not entirely unexpected. When you add vampires to the world, you would naturally have a certain amount of running around and physical conflicts involving vampires. So yes, there's some of that here. But as I noted, there are some very entertaining action scenes in this book. Second point, does it pay off to pay attention? And I'm not quite sure. Could be there were some clues along the way, but I did not spot them, so I can't say for certain. Possibly there is some payoff or paying attention. Is there some detecting going on? Yes, there is. Sherlock Holmes examines crime scenes, Watson interviews witnesses, and again, as can be expected, Sherlock Holmes' chemistry set gets quite a lot of use in this one. And finally are the references to Moriarty in this story, and yes, this story is set in 1902, which is quite late in the chronology of the Sherlock Holmes tales. And there are several references in this book to stories written about Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. So yes, the name of Moriarty does come up. And that's it for the detective review. So, yes, I thought it was very nice, very enjoyable, and I enjoyed reading it. I read through it quite quickly, and that's perhaps the greatest type of praise I can give. I have more than enough books that still languishes uncompleted, so this was not the case for this one. Very nice. And well, if I should add some comments that I haven't already done, to this extent that there are some downsides or problems with this book, it's perhaps that at times it moves a little bit quickly, especially in the start, and I don't know, perhaps taking out the second part of the book and instead having one single narrative that was a little bit more fleshed out at times would have been better. I don't know. It could be. It would at least give the possibility of having a more sort of what to say, satisfying payoff for some of the dramatic events that happened, because there's quite a lot that happens in the start of the book. Of course, the book moving quite quickly means that it sets up the premise for the story very early, and I don't mind that at all. I think that's nice. It's I enjoy that type of structure in a book, so you sort of know where you are going and what direction the book is going, and this book definitely does that, but there are some sort of potentially emotional payoffs that this book does not get, because it sort of rushes through some events that probably would have been more impactful if they had been given a little bit more room to play out. So that's not necessarily that doesn't mean that this is a big problem, more that the book could perhaps have been even better if it had been done slightly differently. Of course, it could have been much worse also. I don't know. We will never know, but that was at least what I was thinking while I read through the first part, that things were moving a little bit too quickly. So, well. Anyway, very much enjoyable, and from what I could see, the second book in what I think is a series of so far 3 books continues the sort of storyline that's created in this book. So presumably it has new cases, or a new case where the characters and the background that is added in this book is the basis. So the world as it is created in this book sort of continues in the next book, from what I could see. I still haven't read it, so I can't say for certain, but that was my impression. And I think that was the next one was based on Jekyll and Hyde, and I'll probably look at that one at some point. Not in the very immediate future, but at some point. I will probably want to read Jekyll and Hyde before I read the next one. I think that was one thing I noted with this book, Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula, that it is probably more entertaining if you have a familiarity with the Count Dracula character and the story as it is written in the original book. So I will probably try to read Jekyll and Hyde before having a look at the next book. So probably some time into the future. And hopefully Dracula shows up again. I think the Dracula character was also very enjoyable. If I have a complaint regarding Dracula, it is that he did not appear more than he did. So hopefully he shows up in the next two books also. And then there was one character that I expected to show up that never did show up, so perhaps he also makes an appearance in some of the later books, at least I hope so. And then I'm sort of curious about the second part of this book. Will this author, or have this author, sort of included stories related to the setting in that part of the book in subsequent books, or was the second part of this book the only appearance of elements from that setting? I wonder. Hopefully there are more elements from the second part of this book also in the later books. And sort of referring to this without sort of saying what it actually is, it's slightly difficult, but well, if you read this book, you will understand quite quickly what I mean. And I think that's perhaps something I would recommend if the idea of a book with Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula sounds interesting. Well, I think this author, Christian Klaver, has done a very good job of creating such a book. So this is a recommend from me. Very nice. And that's everything. And I think rather than the next book in this series, the next thing I will look at will probably be Sherlock Holmes and his friends in the Lovecraft universe. So I have a couple of books related to that lined up, and those will probably be my next reads. So I will hopefully be back in the not too far future with some comments on those books. Okay. And with that, I end it for this time. So, goodbye for now. Goodbye.